Okay, so get ready for a deep dive into Transylvania. Well, not literally, of course, you know. We got a really interesting article from one of our listeners
Yeah.
about the translation history of Dracula in
Mhm.
Romania. And right away, it really makes you think, like, why would a story so tied to this place, be kept hidden from its own people? It's kind of strange, right?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question for sure. It's almost like imagine if your childhood home was rumored to be the inspiration for some crazy famous novel, but like nobody would let you read it.
Exactly. It's like this whole literary mystery with like Romania as the backdrop. So to like get to the bottom of all this, we're going deep into the work of this Duncan Light. He's really done his research into how Romania, especially during these periods of like major cultural change, how they've handled this whole Dracula phenomenon. And spoiler alert, it's way more surprising than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what Late really uncovers is there's this pattern, this like almost guarded control over the whole Dracula narrative. Like if you think about the time period between the world wars, Romania, especially Bucharest, they were embracing everything Western. I mean, it was even called the Paris of the Balkans. So you think, okay, Dracula, gothic thrills and chills, surely it would have been a smash hit there, right?
Yeah. It seems like the perfect setting for like a spooky story to really take off. So was Dracula a hit in like 1920s Bucharest?
I mean, that's where things get kind of interesting. See, Light found these clues that suggest that, yeah, parts of Dracula, they were actually going around Romania back then, maybe even abridged versions. Can you imagine, like, finding out Dracula was some kind of, like, serialized story in a magazine today?
Wait, hold on. Abridged. Serialized. Like, it was like, what this classic horror needs to be chopped up and like sprinkled throughout different monthly issues?
You laugh, but it was more common back then than you might think, yeah. And there's this one magazine in particular that Light points to called Realitatea Illustrata, which was like known for printing horror stories. Imagine if like Dracula was a regular thing in, I don't know, The New Yorker today or something.
Whoa. Okay, that puts it into perspective. The New Yorker and Dracula. I never would put those together. But here's the really weird thing. Light says that actually getting access to, archives from that time period, practically impossible. Like, seriously locked up tight. Guarded with garlic and crucifixes, practically.
And that itself is really telling, don't you think? This wasn't just some random pamphlet. This was Dracula. Seems like even way back then, there was this real effort to control the narrative, to really keep a lid on how Dracula and, by extension, Romania, how they were seen. It's almost like they didn't want the real Transylvania to be overshadowed by the fictional one.
Like, hey, we're more than just vampires over here, guys. We've got mountains, forests. Okay, maybe a few too many castles.
Right, and this whole idea of, like, carefully managing perceptions of Romania, of keeping Dracula at, like, arm's length, becomes even more obvious as we move into, the next chapter of Romanian history, the communist era.
Oh, man. Talk about a plot twist. Communist Romania, right? Strict censorship. Western books being banned all over the place. You'd think Dracula, the ultimate Western vampire story, would be, I don't know, public enemy number one. Right?
It seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But Light's research throws us a curveball.
Oh, I'm always up for a good curveball. What do you find?
Well, there's evidence suggesting that a Romanian translation of Dracula was actually in the works in the early 1970s. Right in the heart of the communist era.
Whoa, wait, seriously, how does that even happen? That's like finding a disco ball in a monastery.
Well, we got to remember, even within the communist era, there were these periods of, like, relative openness. Light talks about this brief cultural thaw under Ceausescu in the early 70s. It was short-lived, but it was enough time for some, let's say, unexpected works to kind of slip through. Even Frankenstein got translated around this time, too.
Wow. So Dracula almost had its moment. So if they were working on a translation, what happened? Why didn't it come out back then?
Well, I mean, it was Ceausescu. That thaw didn't last long at all. He quickly went back to, the full force of censorship. Like somebody slammed the coffin shut right as Dracula was about to make his grand entrance.
So like Dracula's timing was about as good as showing up to a garlic festival, huh?
Pretty much, yeah. But that wasn't the only thing working against Dracula. Remember that cultural thaw we were talking about? Well, 1972, right in the middle of it all, this book, In Search of Dracula, it gets published. And it made this direct link between Dracula and Vlad the Impaler.
Oh, okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this. Vlad the Impaler, national hero, defender of Romania. And they connect him with a blood-sucking vampire.
Exactly. The regime, they'd been working hard building up this image of Vlad as like this strong, almost mythical figure. I mean, he fought against the Ottomans, right? Symbol of Romanian resilience. Having him associated with Dracula, even if it was fictional, that just wasn't going to fly.
Wow, so Dracula, this fictional vampire, gets caught in the middle of a real-life propaganda war.
That's crazy. It makes you wonder about, like, the regular people in Romania back then. They knew about Dracula. They knew about Vlad the Impaler. But they couldn't even read the book themselves to, make up their own minds. And that's what's so interesting, I mean, by trying to suppress Dracula, to control how people saw it, the regime might have accidentally made it even more appealing to Romanians. You know how it is. We want what we can't have.
It's like human nature, right? You tell someone they can't have something, it's like the most desirable thing ever, especially if it seems dangerous or like taboo.
Right. And this whole information gap, this void created by censorship, it led to so much speculation about Dracula. I mean, Light even quotes this one Romanian poet who called Dracula political pornography because of this whole suppression thing. Imagine the rumors that must have been going around.
It probably took on a life of its own, like this forbidden text, more powerful in people's minds because they couldn't actually read it.
Exactly. It's like a perfect example of how trying to control a narrative can totally backfire. It gives the story this almost mythical status.
So for decades, Dracula's stuck in this weird place in Romania. The authorities are afraid of it. The average person doesn't even know what's really in it, but it's always there, lurking in the background. And then, 1989, revolution. Ceausescu is out. Censorship ends. What happens to our friend Dracula then?
Well, it's almost like it was waiting for its moment. Almost immediately, a Romanian translation of Dracula gets published within the year. Kind of poetic, don't you think? Censorship ends and Dracula rises.
Like the final chapter in this whole saga. But after all that anticipation, after being this forbidden text for so long, what was the reaction like? Did Dracula take Romania by storm?
And that's where things get, well, a little underwhelming. Light says that, yeah, there was some initial excitement, sure, but it kind of fizzled out pretty fast.
Really? After all that, what happened?
Imagine, right? You finally get your hands on this forbidden fruit, this book that everyone's been whispering about for years. You open it up expecting something, I don't know, revolutionary.
And you get a pretty decent vampire story.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Dracula in Romania. People finally got to read it and they realized it's just a novel, not some life-changing revolutionary text.
It's like that feeling you get, when someone finally pulls back the curtain and you realize the myth was way more exciting than the actual thing. All those years building it up, imagining what it must be like, and then it's just, well, a vampire story.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it really speaks to the power of a good story, don't you? Even when no one's read it, it still has this impact, Dracula, it shaped how people thought. It even became this symbol, this idea of resistance, just because it wasn't there.
Like a ghost story haunting an entire country.
Yeah.
And it really affected how Romania saw itself, its history, its identity. For the longest time, that ghost story, it had way more power than the real Dracula ever did.
Oh, I completely agree. And that's what Light's work really shows us. It's this constant back and forth, fiction versus reality, how we want to see things versus how they actually are. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating,
It really makes you think, what does it say about a country, when it tries so hard to bury a story, especially when that story is so connected to its own backyard?
It's a question worth asking, for sure. And we see it over and over again, not just with Dracula. Anytime a story challenges how things are supposed to be, it kind of makes you wonder, too, about the opposite. What happens when we do finally get to hear those suppressed stories? What do we find when we get past all the hype, all the buildup, when we finally see these stories for what they are?
That's what's so cool about deep dives like this, I think. It's not just about finding some hidden truth or setting the record straight. It's about, looking at things in a new way, questioning what we think we know.
Seeing familiar things with a fresh perspective, and realizing that sometimes the most interesting stories are right there in front of us. We just gotta know where to look.
So to everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. Think about the stories that have shaped how you see the world, a place, a culture, even just yourself, and how might those stories change? If you took a closer look, what would you find if you went beyond the surface? What are the untold stories just waiting to be discovered?